Magick.me is the world's greatest school for magic, meditation, and mysticism. You can learn everything there, from chaos magic to hermeticism to meditation to how to supercharge your finances and take absolute control of your destiny. In short, you get all of the tools you need to turn chaos into beautiful, scintillating order and master your life. It's incredible. You've probably heard me talk about it on the show quite a lot. But check it out. It's growing fast. And I just want to say, if you're confused about where to start, because I have so many courses there, the Adept Initiative is the place to go. The Adept Initiative is the flagship course on magick.me, and it contains everything you need to know to master the most profound ancient techniques of changing your consciousness and the most modern and cutting-edge tools and systems for absolutely turning your life into a masterpiece. You are really going to dig it. Go check it out, and I will see you in class. It's magick.me, magick.me. All right. Well, I have Aleister Crowley in Paris.
What an excellent book that is.
Indeed. So this is your final, or is it? I think last time we spoke, you said this would be your last Crowley book, but is it?
I think it is. A Polish Thelemite wrote to me recently, who publishes very beautiful Polish versions of Aleister Crowley. And he said, oh, but you must do Crowley in North Africa. And I thought, well, I don't think it's not the right way to finish it. And I don't think I've missed anything important about his time in North Africa. If you've ever read the Stephen Skinner edited diaries for Tunis, it's a miserable time. And in this book, I cover his trip to Tunisia and Algeria with Dorothy Olsen. And I think in the first biography, I also covered the trips with the poet Victor Newberg.
Yes,
I think their trip to Algeria and the Corazon affair and all that. I think it's well covered, and I can't see anything to add to the account of the Book of the Law either. Really.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, unless you disagree. But
although I do want to ask about it, but no, I think because you do visit it in this book. Yeah, I think North Africa as well. I must have spent 80 pages just on that incident in my John Dee book, so I think it's pretty covered. Tell you what, I'm just going to go to the stuff that fascinates me, and we'll do it that way, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Is this going to be part of a series or what?
Well, it will be your, I think, fourth episode on my show. So we did Beast in Berlin back a while ago. It
is a while ago, yeah.
Yeah, we did Crowley in India. And I feel like we did another one as well, just fairly recently, last year.
Well, that would have been Crowley in England.
Yes, that's right. So we have done 4.
So there's been 6 altogether. I think 6 is a good number for Crowley biography, isn't it? That's the thing.
Well,
Solar.
So I'm curious. Actually, let me just start off with this. So now that you've done this series, why did you choose these locations outside of the obvious that he spent a lot of time there? Did they symbolize something? Do each of these locations symbolize something specific to you? In the sense of like a theme or a period or a general thrust of his life.
It wasn't planned. It was never planned that way. It's just grown organically. I think that I was very aware that Crowley's life, in some ways, is like a ribbon of dreams, to quote Orson Welles. It's a movie, but it's also a comic strip. And I was thinking of Tintin.
That's right.
You know,
you'd mentioned
Tintin in America, Tintin in the Congo, Tintin in Tibet. which I grew up with those books and loved them because they had everything, adventure, color, always an interesting theme going on. And Crowley's life in all of those places is a whole. He had a whole life in India. He had a whole life in America. He had a whole life in Berlin. They are lives. It could have been, if I was going to put it all together in a box set, I could call it, The 6 Lives of Aleister Crowley or something like that. The American one came about because I was having so much contact with America through publishing and through my contacts and people I was writing to, talking to. Suddenly America became a very familiar place to me. I started to feel connected with America in a way that I never had in my life before, because obviously as an Englishman, you grow up, America is always something that's imported. And so you see it from that side. You see what's on the crate. You don't see what's in the crate.
So when you saw what was in the crate, what were your thoughts?
I mean, obviously the usual horrors at some extremes, but I mean, I was deeply fascinated by the history of America, and to delve into the past. Suddenly it became real that I know it seems odd, but I had a very Anglo-centric upbringing, and you tend to see everything that happens in the world through the lens of English experience, because we became global before anyone used the term. There were Englishmen everywhere, and I think it was Somerset Maugham maybe who said, or was it Churchill, one of the two, an Englishman has the right to live where the hell he likes because he's a trouble to nobody. And I'd like to think this was still true. Of course, it all depends who's traveling, but there is a kind of desire to learn. Anyway, I tend to see things that Anglo-centric way. And of course, I saw the American history from an Anglo-centric way, even though I had relatives who fought for the Confederates in the Civil War. I think one of them was killed actually in one of the battles near Atlanta, if I remember right. I forget.
Interesting.
And also another relative of mine was the first person to map North Carolina for the Governor Tyron of California, and that was before independence.
I have ancestors in the same area at the same time. I actually have ancestors who came over on the Mayflower, so there may have been some communication. That's
considerably earlier. That's 1620.
Well, because and this later, and then but at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, actually, I have an ancestor.
Right. Well, I think I sort of fell in love with American history, and especially things like the development of the railroads and the beautiful railway stations that used to exist across America, which have been destroyed. I think Prince Charles said about England that our developers had done more damage than Hitler ever did with the Blitz.
Yeah.
And I think it's certainly true in the United States. There seems to be so little of the history of America that's visible. I know there's also so much, there's a lot, but many very, very beautiful, fine, fascinating buildings have been demolished. And when I did the Crowley book, I was very conscious that I wanted to rebuild them in my imagination. The old station at Minneapolis and right across America. I found all that fascinating, and I felt part of it. I felt it's strangely part of it all.
That's wonderful. One thing I've noticed about, and this is somewhat embarrassing, but one thing I've noticed, to my country at least, one thing I've noticed of visitors from outside the U.S., particularly from the UK, is they are much more interested and invested in the story of America, and B, know a whole lot more of its history than Americans usually do, which is embarrassing. But I've been thinking about quite recently, with Crowley, I think that whether this was probably not intentional, but whether intentional or not, Libra Oz, I think, is a better distillation of the ideals of the founding fathers than pretty much anything published since. I feel like that you can hang an American flag off.
I'm actually looking at it now as I speak to you, because I have it on the wall opposite where I work here in the studio. This is the law of the strong and the joy of the world. I wanted to post this to the Kremlin actually this week. Man has the right to live. What is it? Live by his own law. To live in the way that he wills to do, to work as he will, to play as he will, to rest as he will, to die when and how he will. Man has the right to eat what he will, to drink what he will, to dwell where he will, to move on the face of the earth. Man has the right to think what he will, to speak what he will, to write what he will, to carve, etch, draw, carve, build as he will, and so on. And you have, according to Libra Oz, which was written in World War II, of course, when we were fighting Hitler, who didn't want anybody's will but his own, you have the right to kill those who deny this right of the free will. And it's and a lot of Crowley's friends wrote to him and said, for God's sake, don't publish that. It reads like a license to murder.
It also reads like the American Bill of Rights, though.
But better, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree with you.
I think it's more philosophically consistent.
And concise and one-syllable words. I have that pinned to the top of my Twitter account.
And it's not idealistic. I don't think I don't think this is an ideal. This is it's a practical system of ethics.
Yeah, I feel in a way that perhaps this is over-romanticizing, but I don't necessarily think so. I feel that America is, in a way, the cream of the Western magical tradition, and that Enlightenment Masonic tradition found its flowering in the ideals that this country was founded on. But then Libra Oz just distills it perfectly. I think it's one of the best things he ever wrote.
Yes, and it was written under the stress of war. The bombs were dropping all around at that point. He was intimately connected with the war because of his contacts, and because he was bombed out of his own flat in central London by St. James's there. Have you ever been to number 93 Jermyn Street?
I have, actually. I bought there, I think at least when I was there in the early 2000s, there was a brewery beneath where
93 Ale, right?
Yes, and I remember because I bought a bottle of it to keep.
Lovely.
Yeah.
I've got one in the kitchen.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Is it still there?
I've drunk it, of course, but we've kept the bottle.
Okay. Hopefully the brewery is still there.
I'm sure it is.
Very good. Yeah. Well, so let's talk about France. I want to start this off by just asking a broad question here, which is about the French occult world in general, because this is something that I've thought about. Well, it would be better to say that it is something that has a huge influence on what people think of as esotericism, as the occult now, but at least in the English-speaking world, don't have a whole lot of awareness of. And this, of course, includes people like Peladon, Pappas, the Memphis Mizraim rite of Masonry, which is extremely verboten by at least American Freemasons. This is irregular to the extreme. And these, of course, had a big influence on Crowley and also on the OTO. When I've spoken to French friends about the occult in France, their attitude is basically like, oh, yeah, we grew out of that in 1890. That's nice that you're still into this. But I wanted to ask you about the French occult world, and as you were focusing on it in this, your view of it, and how Crowley found himself stepping into it.
Well, I wrote the other book. You see that really the companion volume to this one is Occult Paris, where I trace all the French movement and the so-called French occult revival. So in that, I feel I've done that. Told that story, which is the foundation. Crowley was a late arrival in a scene that had really flowered and was fading by the time he got to Paris. By 1900, the jism, if you like, had gone out of the French movement. And Crowley wrote some tart things about Peladon. I don't think they met, even though they were in Paris at the same time. I don't even know if Crowley ever met Papus. I mean, Papoose went through one ceremony at Mather's house in Auteuil, near the Bois de Boulogne, but I think he was out of curiosity to what Mather's was doing with the Golden Dawn. And of course, Golden Dawn claimed to be the true inheritors of the Rosicrucian line. So Papoose was naturally concerned to make a connection there, because of course he and Péladan together really thought that they were the true inheritors. Crowley was never very impressed by the claims of the French for primacy in occult matters, and he didn't get on at all with the Martinists. There almost no connection. In fact, there's plenty of evidence that the French Martinists were hostile to Crowley very directly, but used subterranean methods to get back at him, like the Review of International Secret Societies, which René Guénon was involved with. So Crowley never felt he had anything to learn particularly. He never even mentions de Guetta, whose books I think were really remarkable on the history of occultism. And he of course, he had the same root as they did, insofar as he loved Baudelaire. And Baudelaire really is the wicked uncle of the French occult revival. He made it exciting for young men to be interested in magic by talking about this deranging of the senses in the Rimbaud sense, and finding a hidden truth that is uniquely yours and yet connects you to a universal magical power, and the idea that one could access this power. Crowley absorbed all this sort of second, third hand through the Golden Dawn mostly, even though he did read a lot of French material. And you find him reading the works of Fabre d'Olivet, who is a very important figure. He read the foundation works of the French occult revival. He didn't involve himself, certainly not with the paramasonic aspect. He wasn't. I think he always found paramasonic orders a bit of a joke. He wasn't. He was unimpressed. I mean, you mentioned Memphis Mizraim rite, which is a combined rite. He ran it, I think, because people he knew wanted that Masonic connection, and when he knew that the Theosophists were trying to get control of it, he felt duty bound to make himself known. Because, Crowley has this long-running battle through his life with Theosophy, which he felt that after Blavatsky, it should have gone to him. He felt he understood, he always felt he had a unique understanding of Blavatsky, but Blavatsky was only the foundation. I think in my book, Occult Paris, I go into the whole impact of Theosophy and Parisian occultism, which was enormous, absolutely enormous. Because Blavatsky used to stay with the Duchess of Caithness, who lived just off Avenue Wagram, which runs off the Place d'Étoile by the Arc de Triomphe. So very rich lady indeed. I mean, she was incredibly wealthy. She had a huge house in Paris. She had another massive place down on the south coast of France, and she had property in England as well. And Blavatsky lived off her to some extent. I always thought that the Duchess of Caithness would have got on very well with Crowley, actually, if they'd met. And they had a lot in common, because she was very much interested in Anna Kingsford idea that the true breakthrough of the new age, the new era that they saw coming, was a redefinition or re-understanding of the place of women in the world, and that this whole interest in androgyny and the equality of the sexes and the mutual interdependence, that was really part of Crowley's outlook as well. I mean, he could idealize women on one hand as a spiritual thing, but of course, when he met them flesh and blood, he tended to he, the idealism took him away from how can I say, there was a clash between his perception of women as the weaker sex, shall we say, and woman as what she is going to become. And of course, the Book of the Law is full of this thrusting independence of woman. And he recognized it, and he tried to practice it in this way and that way. I'm
writing down some notes here because I want to circle back to Theosophy and also Rose Kelly in regards to what you were just talking about. But if you were going to come back to French occultism or Memphis Mizraim in particular, I'm interested in, because it seems that, you know, certainly he cites that in his version of the OTO and as being a continuation. I've read the initiation degrees and they're actually really interesting. There's tons of things about the planet Sirius and Odin and all these other world mythologies. So I thought they were actually surprisingly really interesting. But of course, they also seem to have gone not into the English or, you know, the Anglo-American world, but into Haiti and kind of the Afro-Caribbean world. There still seems to be links to Memphis Mizraim. So because it's the Francophone world.
Interesting. Yeah, Crowley tried to reduce the 95 degrees to 10. How successfully, I don't know. I don't think he regarded, as I say, I don't think he took it very seriously, personally.
Maybe I should ask a more pointed question then, and also broad in its own way, about his time in the French occult world. What is it, if anything, that he got from French occultism that he did not have already or later get from the English-speaking world? What did he take away?
Well, I don't think it was from French occultism. In fact, one of the great things that comes over in the new book, Aleister Crowley in Paris, is it's what he took to Paris that's as interesting as what he took from Paris. And he certainly, as I say, he had very little to do with the French occult societies that existed, what was left of them anyway. And Paris to him meant freedom. It meant art. It meant tolerance. It meant social idealism. It didn't mean modernity in quite the way that I think he had. I think Crowley had an extraordinary feeling for a modern future, a different kind of person, a different kind of society. Obviously, Paris is always stuck in its history to a large extent, and any new movement that tries to brush that away ends up very fatigued. You know, if you go to Paris now, and you'd never have known that if you'd been there in 71, it was full of hippies and, you know, dope smoking, very more visible, and a much more romantic place certainly than it is now. Paris has kind of seen that off. It tends to see, Paris has a way of seeing movements off, you know, from Paris 68 to the 68 rebellion and all the rest of it. It just sort of eats them up. And I think it's a curious thing about Paris. Paris doesn't fundamentally change, it seems to me. I don't know whether it's partly the architecture or the nature of the French bourgeoisie. But Paris certainly wasn't going to change for Crowley. But then again, Crowley didn't change for Paris. What he found there mostly was art. His first experiences of Paris long-term is he goes to stay as a sort of guest of his younger friend, Gerald Kelly, who's establishing him or trying to establish himself as a painter in Montparnasse. And Crowley rents a room opposite his. And he gets to know all Kelly's young friends, practically all of whom distinguish themselves within 4 or 5 years in the Salon d'Automne, which is the exhibition for new artists, people who weren't necessarily accepted by the establishment yet, but whose pictures were up for sale. And he had a great belief that Gerald Kelly would be a true artist because they seem to have an awful lot in common. Didn't work out at all. And as the book shows, Kelly turned against Crowley in I think a very nasty way indeed. And Crowley was afterwards very sarcastic and not at all accurate about his friendship with Kelly at the time. And the other thing that was fascinating when I did the book was to find out that Crowley's Confessions, which is in some aspects a bit of a literary masterpiece, and some of the rhetorical statements and phrasing of it is quite magnificent, certainly on your first experience of the book. But I'd always thought that the Confessions was pretty truthful. I think Crowley was generally an honest person. I thought that the account was reliable, but I found when it came to talking about Paris, especially between 1902, 1903, 1904, 1905, which is when he first was immersed. I mean, really immersed. I mean, he was going to Paris sort of every other week. If he came back to England, he was soon off to Paris again. I mean, he was living there almost then, right through the so-called, we call it the Edwardian period, the period of Edward VII, the last sort of dawn of a world that didn't quite happen because the First World War destroyed so much that was building up in that period. So I've lost my thread.
You were talking about Gerald Kelly, and he's a prominent character throughout the book in this period of Crowley's life.
Yeah. What I found was that Crowley's account of his time was extremely misleading, obscured some very, very important facts. For example, he was engaged to a lady, the Honourable Eileen Gray, who was studying art. She's a remarkable woman now, getting real attention. There's an exhibition of her in the Museum of Art in Dublin. She's now becoming famous. She was a furniture designer, interior designer. She designed a house that Le Corbusier thought was a masterpiece. Really remarkable woman. He had a profound relationship with her, which only broke off when he met Rose. And he was actually, he was engaged to her. He even gave her a diamond brooch. And that is a relationship that's never been explored in any book at all, and certainly not by Crowley himself.
Do you feel there was a reason that he obscured it or decided not to memorialize it?
I think he developed a view of that whole period that was drenched with disappointment and bitterness. Crowley was not normally a bitter person, but I think there are traces of bitterness over what happened to his marriage. And while his marriage started to go wrong after about after their first daughter, Lilith, died, after the walk across China, as he called it, which is sort of 1906. After that, the relationship starts to go sour. But as that went sour, his relationship with Gerald Kelly really plummeted, because, of course, he was married to Gerald Kelly's sister.
So I really wanted to ask you about this period. In fact, I pulled out a passage because this period is, I feel, so critical for Crowley in so many ways, both personally and in the development of his magical philosophy and personal spirituality. And it's also one of the times when Crowley is his most human. And I just highlighted one paragraph you wrote, which is: the following year in 1906, after completing a family trek across a region of southern China, daily invoking Adonai after the sudden shocking death of daughter Lilith in Rangoon, after a voyage across the Pacific, a journey across Canada to New York City, a return across the Atlantic to Britain, after psychological shock, illness, and convalescence in a nursing home, which I didn't know about, Crowley experienced samadhi, and for the next 11 years, the artist died to the prophet, mystic, and magician. And as you touched on, the friendship of poet Aleister Crowley and painter Gerald Festus Kelly died too. So this, for me, I mean, he's doing his kind of completing his Ebermelin operation, and yet this profound tragedy is happening in his life, which I don't know how much he actually wrote about it. So I really wanted to ask you about this, I think, kind of critical point in the development of his character.
I think he felt the loss, the breakdown of the marriage. I think was a terrible blow for him. The loss of his first daughter was a terrible blow, and he wasn't a person to wear his heart on his sleeve. He was a Victorian. You didn't talk much about those things, and that was one of the. That's why I think I love this of all the Crowley books, of the whole collection, because I feel we're getting much closer to the emotional man and much closer to his real personality. Also, you can get that in the letters he writes to Gerald Kelly, because he never wrote letters like that to anybody ever again. Never the very easy intellectual game playing. A lot of them read like Monty Python sketches. They're surreal, hilarious. His guard is down, and most of these letters have never been published before. And the real challenge for me was to make sense of them, because there are so many references that have never been explained. What does this? Who's that person? Who's that person? And they're just people he's meeting in the hustle and bustle of Paris, Montparnasse. And to trace all that was to create a completely untold picture of Paris in 1902, 03, and 04 particularly. And it's a wonderful trip. It's like seeing Gigi for real life. If you've ever seen that movie, it's very colorful.
Yes,
evocation of Paris in 1900, but much more nuanced and sexy and poetic. I think it's the critical period of Crowley's life. I think the Edwardian period I always felt was his golden age. It's when he discovers himself, he discovers his real powers, such as they are, and he has to find out who he is. And it's agony for him, a lot of it. And people are often offended by a kind of arrogant sheen over Crowley, but this was all defensive. The guy had suffered terrible losses in that period, and he knew very well that a lot of it was his own doing.
So, if I'm remembering correctly, there's a poem from this period, and I've tried to find it and I can't find it, where he's lamenting the failure of his marriage, and he's saying, and the death of his child, and he's saying, I'm sure you know it, Rose, Rose, my head hits the floor.
Is that Rose of Decidua?
Perhaps, yeah.
It's the final cycle of Rose poems. Yes, my head hits the floor,
and it's just unbelievably tragic, and you can feel it just reading it, and so let me just ask why, and because this has been a subject of that people harp on, that people jump on this period also to say, well, Crowley drove everyone around him crazy. Why did Crowley's marriage fail? And also, why did his child die? One of the things Crowley doesn't really talk about really at all, if I'm right, is his kids, of which there were several. So what happened? What happened to cause the marriage to fail?
The same thing that caused it to start. It was just you could say chance events gathering up at a certain point. The marriage in the first place was completely and utterly unexpected, and was regarded by everybody involved, other than the two protagonists, Rose and Edward Alexander Crowley, as some kind of catastrophic joke, a delinquency. So it's not like the marriage got off to a great start in many ways. He was almost immediately at odds with Rose's parents. Her father was the vicar of Camberwell, which is a very handsome rectory in London, and was quite an important position. And his father had been quite famous, and they were significant people in the London scene, the Kellys. And he fell out with the mother and father almost straight away, because they said, all right, if you have to, now you've married my daughter, you must give her a financial settlement. And Crowley said, that was never part of my arrangement. we didn't get married for that reason. He always had this thing that marriage and that sex, love, and money had nothing to. Sex, love had nothing to do with money. If you introduce money into it, you were talking about selling somebody. You know, and he didn't want to buy Rose. They loved each other. That's why they were together. I mean, that thing about financial settlements has almost gone now in Western European society, although it's still active in the East. You get this idea that
like the dowry.
The dowry idea, it's like saying, well, if you must take a woman, you know,
pay for it.
Absolutely, but the whole notion of it somehow.
Well, now people pay on the back end instead of up front. You know, we just shifted it around.
Yeah, he hated any kind of constraint where that was concerned. It wasn't just he didn't want to spend the money, because that's true too. Because Crowley was generous on the one hand, but I mean in the other way he was always quite careful. He could be quite careful with money. He certainly didn't throw it away. The things he spent it on, though, were things other people would think were secondary, like having books published, printing, things like that. But anyway, back to the point, why did the marriage fail? Well, the marriage failed in the obvious thing because, unfortunately, Rose inherited her mother's alcohol habits. That's one reason. Another reason is they weren't getting on terribly well, especially after Lilith died. I think they both internalized the pain of that, and it put a barrier between them. I think they had trouble being together. After that. This was a lovely girl, you know, who he was so proud of. And he later on in his confessions, written much later, and in this Spirit of Bitterness I mentioned, he suggests it was all the mother's fault. She hadn't cleaned the nipple of a bottle, and the child had died of an infection picked up in Rangoon. But it depends how you read it. He left Rose to take the baby home directly to England because he wanted to go across America and get money to do a second Kanchenjunga expedition. So he had the plan to go sail to San Francisco, then go across the Rockies, down from Toronto into New York. And he thought he'd just find people who wanted to finance a scientific expedition to Kanchenjunga. And Rose was quite happy to get on the ship, which he paid for, with the baby, and go directly back, because it was time of the British Empire. All these places were nicely linked by ships. And so she was coming back on her own with the baby. Unfortunately, as happened so often in those days, children, you know, the child had very little immunity. And even though it had survived this incredible long trek across southeast China, Yunnan province, Lilith died. And I think that was the main thing. She turned to drink, and he turned to other women, if indeed he'd ever stopped seeing other women. As far as I can tell from their relationship, she'd been married before. She wanted money for an abortion at the time he first met her. So she was a pretty wild girl, this Rose. She'd been to Paris. She knew relatives of friends of Crowley's in Paris. They must have actually met at some point, certainly in the same room in Paris before they finally met. But he was trying to get her out of one liaison so she could go off with another guy and persuade her mother that it was okay to do. And he said, I tell you what, you want to get out of that situation? Well, marry me and I'll let you, and you go off and do what you like. That was the basis that they met. You have your free life. You can take my name, you know, and that'll get you out of this guy who wants to marry you and you can't shake him off. And then they just found that they fell in love, which was very unusual, because when they first met, they were so shy together. I think when on the first train ride they took, Crowley didn't know what to say to her. He just thought, well, she's got no education. I can't discuss Euripides. I can't discuss poetry with her. It's no good trying to discuss magic. I certainly can't discuss the philosophy that drives me. I'm not going to be able to discuss Nietzsche. And she's probably not really interested in golf. What the hell? He described her as an empty-headed woman of society, but she was also very intelligent. She had a kind of native intelligence and a huge sort of sexual charm. And on that level, they certainly clicked. But no one ever interviewed Rose, which is a terrible sadness, because of course she is the critical component of the whole Book of the Law story. All of that is Rose. Why was his holy guardian angel called Aiwass? Rose told him that his name was Aiwass.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, that all came from Rose.
So that I really want to focus in on, because you talk in your book, you go into depth on this, and I think this is something that people have. There's of course been an effort to resuscitate and look further into the careers of female occultists like Pamela Coleman Smith and certainly Rose Kelly. And you talk about in the book that she's basically the initiator of that period of transmitting the Book of the Law, which is, of course, the central event of Crowley's whole life. And that, it seems as if, I don't want to get mystic and say that this seems to be the reason for their marriage, but I'm super curious about your take on this after looking at this and what role she played in that event.
Oh, you're talking about Cairo 1904 specifically?
Yeah. Or in general as a magical initiator in Crowley's life, but that's specifically.
She'd shown no interest in magic. That's at least what he said. But a lot of those sorts of statements that Crowley made in Confessions, which sound absolute, are not really very absolute. And I'm sure she'd have picked up. She was part of the zeitgeist. There was a lot of occultism around in British middle-class society. And my grandmother, who was born in 1901, told me that, everybody in those days was doing seances, as a family activity, gathering around the table, lights out, join the hands.
Life before television. That's great.
Yeah, life before television was an afterlife.
More proof that time is running in reverse.
Yeah. I think that was what it was. I think people needed, in that age of science and progress, they needed to have a taste of the afterlife. And I think spiritualism so-called spiritualism provided that. So I'm sure they all knew about that sort of thing. And it's a perennial fascination. We'd all like to know, and all the rest of it. So I don't think Rose was naive about magic entirely. She obviously wouldn't have read the intellectual classics, but she might well have picked up some of Crowley's books and leafed through. And I dare say, once she fell in love with him, she would have sat down and browsed through the things that he'd produced. But he says that he gives an exhibition game of magic. An exhibition game is when you show off, like at snooker or billiards. On a ball game like that. He said, I'll give her an exhibition game of magic by invoking the sylphs in the Great Pyramid in Cairo, Gizeh, just on the edge of Cairo. And it works. He can't believe it. This light appears in the chamber, the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid, and she's duly impressed. Now, that may have made more an impression on her than you'd imagine. Now,
that's pretty impressive, doing magic in the Great Pyramid for your honeymoon. That's in the days before reality television. That's pretty good.
Yeah, and you've got to remember also that the view of Egyptian mythology and history at that period, in the circles that Crowley was familiar with, the thought was that the Egyptians had a proto-scientific cosmic philosophy. That's the kind of feeling that was coming out of the translations of the pyramid texts, Book of the Dead, this sort of thing, was that the Egyptians were much smarter than we probably think of them today. It's become fashionable in the last few years to suggest, for example, that Egyptian culture is basically African rooted. That wasn't the view in Edwardian England or 19th century America or France. The idea was that that Egypt was the source of Greek culture. So part of the mystique that's what's driving the Book of the Law. Crowley was also well aware of the Askew Codex and the Bruce Codex of Gnostic manuscripts that had been brought back in the one case by James Bruce, and maybe the Askew Codex.
Which were I haven't heard of those before. Which were those?
Right. In 1773, James Bruce, the Laird of Kinnaird, descendant of Robert the Bruce, the Scottish hero of Bannockburn, comes back from 3 years in Ethiopia and Egypt. He went to find the source of the Nile. This is before the French Revolution. He comes back with a set of texts. Some of them are in Ethiopian language, Ge'ez, as it's called, which includes the Book of Enoch. It was the first time the Book of Enoch had been seen in the Western world for over 1,000 years. And he brought it back from the Church of Ethiopia, where it was part of the Bible in Ethiopia. He also brought back several Gnostic the books of Jew, as they call Jehu, the books of Jehu he brought back, which are Gnostic ascent accounts. Crowley was aware of those, of magical, as he would have seen it, magical literature coming out of Egypt. So I think that was in his mind as well. And he'd have probably told Rose about that sort of thing. And of course, he arrives in Cairo dressed as a Persian prince. As was his wont, Haywa Khan, the beast Khan. So, he's tripping, actually. He's tripping. He's taken Rose to Cyprus, to Ceylon, Sri Lanka today, and they've gone big game shooting, and she suddenly finds she's pregnant, which is hardly surprising in their first year of marriage. And he says, well, we better. Well, he'd planned to take her to meet Alan Bennett in Burma, and they may even have got to Burma. It's not clear, but they said, well, we'll amble back and have the baby in the summer at Boleskine, his country estate in Scotland by Loch Ness, and we'll call in at Egypt again on the way back. So it wasn't a planned thing to go to Egypt at all. It happened because Rose was pregnant and wanted to get into more familiar climes, and so they come back to Port Said. He goes back to his Anglo Egyptian society that was flourishing there at the time. I mean, the British were running Cairo, really. And there was the Turf Club, which was a British officers' club and high society club. And every English person who went to tour the pyramids would end up at the Turf Club. And there was a hell of a lot of sort of sex scenes going on. And it was, upper class adventuring. Crowley liked it and didn't like it, hated it. But he always enjoyed the authentic experience. He liked going around the back streets, and he'd much rather find some prostitute, of a local girl than flatter an English wife who was quite happy to offer herself, even though she was married. Mm-hmm. Good old Western Protestant hypocrisy was very much the rule for people, and especially in hot weather. The English in the hot weather do tend to behave differently.
This explains.
I don't speak from experience.
I see. Yeah, this explains Benidorm and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. They get very, very frisky and silly. I say they. You see,
yes. Having traveled, not as much as Australians, though, having traveled quite a bit and witnessed people away from their home country.
Yes. So they were all away from home, but Crowley actually always preferred the natives of anywhere he was to the. He always tried to avoid English society if he could, and there's some wonderful letters he writes to Gerald Kelly about his attitude to the English society that he encountered in Cairo. Now, you must know that, you will obviously know the story that she suddenly starts to say, "They're waiting for you," and he probably thought, "Oh, well, she's pregnant. She's partly hallucinating, partly fantasizing." He didn't take it seriously, which I can well understand. But also, he also is tripping. I mean, because he's got this, as we found out in the first biography, which nobody had written about before, he's got this lesion on his tongue.
Yes, you mentioned this.
Now, that might have been a mosquito bite or something like that.
Why would that have altered his consciousness? Thank you for reminding me that's in your book. I'm not sure why. Why would a tongue lesion change his?
Well, because say it was a mosquito bite, for example. He might have had a form of malaria, and then he'd be hallucinating. He says that he was convinced that the experience he was going through was not a hallucination caused by the tongue lesion, which would have poisoned his mental activity, but it had provided, by some means, the ability to hear the voice of Aiwass. He makes that distinction. He didn't hallucinate the voice of Aiwass. He thinks the lesion somehow affected his sensorium, which means his whole sensory equipment in his brain, which was a subject, by the way, he was very interested at the time. I mean, actual psychology and psychiatry more than psychology, actually. Remember, he meets Henry Maudsley on the boat between Sri Lanka and Cairo, most famous English psychiatrist at the time. There's a Maudsley Hospital in London still going. Now, he discusses with him whether certain Buddhist trances could damage the brain. That was a subject that he was interested in. You must have read The Testament of Magdalen Blair, his horror story.
I haven't actually. I've read. I think his Buddhist writing from this period is some of his best and most lucid, and it's also some of the best writing on Buddhism, in my opinion.
Well, he often gives things away in his fiction.
Oh, I have to read that then. I have a copy of it.
Well, it's only insofar as it's what happens in the mind when a person's dead. That's a subject that was being investigated at the time by psychiatrists in Paris, actually, and he was interested in that. He wanted to know how much of spiritual experience is in fact just a mental experience. In other words, can you just find the right way of turning the brain on and you will get a spiritual experience?
I mean, that's eminently rational and modern, and does not. I mean, I feel like that's more rational than many, as I think you kind of touch upon, modern psychologists approach this subject, which is, I mean, phenomenal given Crowley's reputation. It's like he truly was, like, I don't know what the words are, but he was a serious individual.
I think that comes across, I hope, in all the books I've done, is that he was not really an occultist at all, in the sense of the way people understand that word and the way people often fantasize that they would like to be. He was very happy to use words like magic, etc., because he was partly as romantic and he was very boyish about the stuff. But his basic attitude to the whole matter was scientific. And he was part of the rationalist. Thomas Henry Huxley is one of his favorite philosophers. Thomas Henry Huxley is the origin of the British Rationalist Association. So if you cannot find a rational explanation for something, you had better be agnostic about it. You say, if there's no rational explanation, then we do not know, and that's Crowley's view. So he wasn't a religious magus in the way that, say, John Dee was, who's really superstitious. John Dee is superstitious.
Yes.
He really, it would be very easy to get John Dee to be scared, I think.
He was very credulous also, but this is something about Crowley that I think it's wonderful that you bring it out and should be continually underlined about him. I mean, I sometimes get the feeling reading Crowley that he's a bit like Richard Burton on safari in occult land, and views it kind of from an outside, as if he's kind of like not necessarily looking down on it, but he's going to go there, cut through the bushes, and explain it to everyone. But of course, he ends up being the most infamous figure of the entire thing and becoming the marketing symbol of the entire thing.
Yeah, and that is a colossal misrepresentation. It's just one of those things. He because he was quite happy to be called the Great Beast and all the rest of it. He opens himself up to that. He invites it. Part of him, I think, is inviting it.
Well,
and part of
it ensures that people remember him. I mean, it's great marketing.
Yes, I mean, didn't work all that well for him, though. It wasn't. I think.
I mean, well, just how many people do you hear talking about Paul Foster Case?
Well, I would have said very few personally, but
right.
I used to know somebody who was really into it.
Well, yeah, I mean, the people who are the cognoscenti, you know, but it's like everyone knows Crowley, even if you're not into this. So I think that worked out well in a way, but not to cut you off.
I think yeah, there really are two kinds of occultists, in my opinion. There's Crowley occultists, and then there's theosophical occultists. I think there's a great gulf between them. I used to know a lady, I wish I still did, because she's very nice, lived in Florida a long time, and we had really good just writing letters over the years. And she got more and more into theosophy and more into Hinduistic Brahmanism, and more inclined to listen to the next guru who happened to come along. And the more she started to absorb of this theosophical and Brahmanistic take on everything, the more hostile she was getting towards my interest in Aleister Crowley. It was very interesting. Even though when she'd first read the books, she was very keen on it. And I watched the psychology change over the time, and it was very interesting. I thought it was teaching me a lesson. It was emblematic. I don't think there will ever be a rapprochement between the theosophical school and the Crowleyan school at all. I don't think it's possible.
What do you think? I agree with you, although I think the Crowley school will survive and theosophy probably will not. What was the core of that psychological change?
In who?
In this person that you're talking about who experienced this change going into the more theosophical and Brahmanistic worldview and then becoming hostile to Crowley.
I haven't worked it out exactly. I think at the time when it first happened, I probably had a very clear idea of it. But since I'm not really sure whether it was some fear, it was the old demon Crowley thing, or that I wasn't impressed by these gurus, you know. I mean, I'm with Crowley in that one, you know. You can call yourself a guru if you teach somebody something. Did you ever hear John Lennon's spoof character he created for a bit of fun, The Great Walk? Because the great walk must be done.
No, I have not heard that. I thought you were going to say his original version of Sexy Sadie about the Maharishi, which is vicious and hilarious and angers people who follow him every time I post it online.
Oh, well, in his maturity, in about 1978, he started doing tapes, like guidance tapes. They were spoof guidance tapes, where he creates a kind of he's like the Dalai Lama, and he does a most incredibly good impression of the Dalai Lama.
Oh, I gotta find that.
Oh, it's there's an extract on it on the John Lennon anthology, which was a box set of CDs that Yoko released in 1997.
That's hilarious.
And it's called The Great Walk. And it's like, should cure you of gurus and exaggerated respect for Asian males who discuss the infinite. You know, it is a strange thing. All American children are brought up with excellent basic scientific teaching. They're really good science books in America. Well, I think I found
depends what state you grow up in.
Oh, okay. Well, my dad always said that the American books on mathematics for young people were much more accessible. than the British ones, which tended to be over the heads of young people, because they're written by old dons, who just never met young people.
I see. Yeah.
Anyway, I think there was always seemed to be when I grew up, a good scientific base. And yet the moment, and it seemed to me, an American goes to India. I interviewed Patrick Swayze in his hotel room back in '92. And he'd just done a film with Roland Joffe, or was doing it. He was still making it. I can't remember the name of it. It did quite well, I think. Anyway, he'd gone to film it in Calcutta with Roland Joffe, and he'd fallen in love with India. He'd started playing music with a sitarist and all this, and it was just why is it if the guy's got a turban on his head or an exotic Indian accent, why are you more prepared to listen to that person? What is this mystique of the East? Is it because they're just so much more plausible in the way they put over what really boils down to Sunday school? It boils down to Sunday school teaching. I mean,
that's a good point.
It's basic stuff, really. But if you pick up a few words like karma, karma. I mean, talk about a joke. I mean, it's cause and effect, no more, no less. We have Isaac Newton. Hit the billiard ball, it will carry on until some other force stops it. That's karma.
Yeah, I think in our last interview, you or one of our podcasts, you used the phrase California Hinduism, which I thought was hilarious.
I have to be careful. I have to be more careful these days because you've got another generation coming up with their sensibilities to all these things are not so tuned into the humorous as people who grew up, I think, in the 60s and 70s.
Unfortunately, unfortunately,
I think they missed out on
Go ahead.
Yeah, missed out on Monty Python.
Yes. Yeah, but totally, I think we were discussing, like quote unquote Hinduism, which really doesn't mean a whole lot in India versus, Californians' fantastical idea of it are two completely separate things. And I will say that having been to India and been down that road myself for quite a while, yeah, I agree. But at the same time, and Crowley obviously was in the same camp, the actual technology of quote unquote of yoga is a big deal. There's nothing, doesn't necessarily have to be particularly Hindu or mystic or Oriental, as Crowley, I think, very, very, very showed very well. I still think that his instructions on yoga and what he took from Ellen Bennett is honestly the best writing on the subject, at least that I've read, in terms of demystifying and showing you how to do it. But
that's it. Was it sit down, shut up, get out, wasn't it?
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. 8 lectures on yoga is hilarious.
I've missed one out. The concise initiated instruction is sit down, shut up, stop thinking, get out.
Well advised. I want to return to Rose Kelly though, just so we don't lose the thread of that.
Sorry about that. I don't know how we got onto all that.
Oh no, it's all. This is a podcast. It just goes how it goes. It's a conversation.
Okay.
But Rose Kelly. So you say, I think quite directly, that she is kind of the initiating figure, at least within this, when Crowley does begin to receive the Book of the Law. One thing I want to ask is, where does this stand in relation to, I hate when people ask me questions like this, so forgive me, but where does this stand in relation to his involvement with mescaline? And of course, he'd been writing about cannabis indica already, but I think I've spoken to multiple people, including Richard Spence, who wrote Secret Agent 666, that say that who have told me that Crowley was already, steeped in mescaline at this point and probably was using it in Egypt. I don't know if that's valid or not, but it's worth asking.
Yeah, there's no evidence that he was using mescaline in Egypt. I'm trying to think of when he starts experimenting with it, what year it was. I think by about by around maybe 1906. I mean, his first big experiments with hashish, really serious experiments, are in 1906. That's when he's trying to see what it can do. And when he has samadhi, he'd combined it with cannabis, and I can't remember whether he smoked it or ate it. When he took mescaline, it was in chocolate drops. And his big experiment is in 1916 at Lake Pasquaney in New Hampshire, or Newfound Lake, near Bristol, New Hampshire, which I write about in detail in Crowley in America. That was when I think mescaline really he really getting into it, and from an analytical point of view. But I think he also took it. I seem to remember him taking mescaline in Venice with Layla Waddell in about 1908, 1906, could be 07, 08, around that time. Again, Edwardian period. I mean, he must have been the only person who ever saw Paris that year while tripping. You know, can you imagine what it was like?
Probably.
Well, you get
Probably, I don't know. Paris always smells very bad to me, so it must have been exacerbated. But that's my heathen American view.
Surely, if you'd lived in Calcutta, you would hardly notice Paris.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But I went to Paris before India, so you know.
Oh, right.
I expected it in India, not in Paris.
Yeah, I always remember the smell of the metro in Paris.
Yeah, right. Right. It's disgusting, right?
It is. You can tell you're not far from the sewers, you know, that's for sure. Yeah. But, and of course, in the old days, it was mixed with Gauloise, the French cigarette. This combination of sort of vaguely sewer-like smell with Gauloise, you know, it was pretty, took some getting used to, should we say. So what was the question we were talking about, Rose? Well,
I guess just to ask flat out, I mean, do you think there is a possibility that drugs were involved in this in 1904 in Cairo, or was it completely sober with perhaps this tongue lesion playing a role in it?
If the drugs had been a factor in the reception of the Book of the Law, I think he'd have written about it. He didn't hide that drugs were involved with the Samadhi experience. In fact, he went to see his friend George Cecil Jones and says, look, well, am I kidding myself? You know, because was I getting off on a high from this little bit of cannabis I took? Or was it spiritual? And Cecil Jones reassures him. He says, no, it's just it's too what's happened to you is so incredible. I think at one point he says he thought that he would have glowed. Literally, he felt he must be glowing like a holy man. That his aura felt so radiant, you know. And I seem to recall somebody making that comment about him. That there was something had changed. It you know, crossed over from, as it were, the spiritual into the physiological.
Interesting.
But I think if drugs had been involved in that, he would have written. I mean, there are some mysteries about 1904. One of them is he made some notes, but when he wrote up the experience, you've got to remember he wrote it up from the notebook, which I've had in my hands quite a few times. The Book of Results is the main little notebook about this big, you know, very neat writing. But he even says that he put ridiculous things in it and he said for no good reason. You know, what looked like codes, but he said were just nonsense. I mean, that is an odd thing to do. But then Crowley could do some very odd things anyway.
Do you mean in the Book of the Law itself? Or
no, in the Book of Results, in his notes from that period. Also, it's evident to me from the notebook that he was already experimenting with some kind of sex magic with Rose that summer. And he talks about experiments with Beel, meaning Beelzebub. And he obviously got something off the Cairo experience that he didn't take very far. He did do a ritual. It's all in the first Crowley biography. He wrote this ritual out, which basically is a sex ritual for him and Rose to perform, based on, she's Newt and he's Hadith.
Mm-hmm.
So he'd got the notion, it didn't take much getting really, that the universe is a kind of orgasm of two principles. Now people say, "Oh, that's Tantra," Well, what Tantra just means book, but the notion of a cosmos being born out of the collision of opposites doesn't strike me as particularly original. But Crowley saw these hieroglyphics and these images, and for him, he thought that it's obvious that the Egyptian sages had understood this as a scientific principle, and they just expressed it in a mythology for the benefit of the ordinary peasants. And I think that was his view of religion in general, was that religion is all based on a scientific philosophy, but it's put in story form so that the ordinary people can get into it, because uneducated people can't think very easily in abstracts.
It's interesting that I agree. It's interesting that he would have that view, though, instead of the perhaps more cynical view that religions are control systems created by a priesthood caste for the peasants.
Well, I think his view of that would have been that's what's so useful about them.
I see. Yes. Okay.
But on the other hand, you've got to remember with Crowley, it's always and on the other hand, because he always saw both sides. Of course, he wanted to see the end of priestcraft. Unenlightened priestcraft was what he wanted to see an end of, where the priestcraft isn't enlightening the people slowly, it's deliberately obscuring them. So he's in favor of Martin Luther. He says in his diary when he's in Germany in 1930-31, he says, Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon, who gave us our first freedom.
Mm.
Now Martin Luther, obviously founder of modern Protestantism, along with some other major figures, but he made the important political move and stood out. And he says the founder of our first freedom. So no, you shouldn't take my slightly cynical line too literally, or his cynical line too literally. I think on the one hand, he could say that, well, when you've got a superior intelligence, you have the opportunity to make a new world. You can manipulate the forces that exist in a society and you can raise them up, but you're never going to be able to raise all of them up. And you're never going to be able to raise them up either quickly or all together. So what you do is you plant seed ideas that are accessible to people and that they will grow with them. And I think all the enlightened influences in history have always been like that. They all start with a kind of magical fascination that somebody's got an amazing power that draws you to them magnetically. The Beatles had it, did they not? And I don't want to be Timothy Leary there, who actually made it so explicit that it was an embarrassment. I mean,
what was his line on that?
Oh, well, he took the Beatles as four avatars from the absolute, who've come to turn on humanity, which was a dreadful thing to say to four musicians from Liverpool who were just trying to make sense of their experience as best they could.
Funny story about. Go ahead.
Well, the question is how much of the Leary bullshit did the Beatles actually take to heart? Because if you listen to Lennon's Plastic Ono Band album, which is the Denial record, where I don't believe in Beatles and so on, he's had to go through an experience to get out of thinking of the Beatles. I love
that period. I love that. It's very honest and human. And I love his parodies of gurus during that period, like the Maharishi. Funny story about that, though, Timothy Leary. My dad was actually the first person to interview Timothy Leary for the local paper in San Diego when he got out of jail in the 70s. And he walked directly out of jail with no shoes on and prison scrubs, and immediately gathered a gang of, 13 acid casualty followers, and went to a restaurant where my dad attempted to interview him while he was holding court. And then he was kind of like, my dad recalls him very performatively looking into space, talking about, the future, and then was looking to see if anyone was looking and noticing how profound he was being. And then, of course, he stiffed at the end. He stiffed my dad for all 13 people's or thereabouts food. They just took off and left the bill with him. So that's my Timothy Leary story for today.
That's great. I like that story. And I remember I used to know an Australian journalist who interviewed him in the 90s, late 80s, I think it was, around 1991, that kind of. And she said that the room had lightened up when he spoke. And I must say I was a little bit skeptical. Yeah. But that there was almost like physical.
Do you mean literally, or just that people were?
Yeah,
literally. Okay. Well, I don't know about that.
And I thought that, I thought it always will if you're a believer.
Was she on acid at the time?
Maybe. I don't know what she was on, but I'd like to have been on it as well.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm friends with his son as well, who's been on this podcast several times, Zach Leary. So and Genesis, who Genesis Peerage was, spent a lot of time with Tim Leary and really, really liked him, and told me about that too. So I don't want to paint a wholly negative picture. And I don't think he was a wholly negative individual, but certainly controversial in not altogether good ways.
Well, I used to know Derek Taylor, the Beatles press officer who organized the Monterey Pop Festival, as opposed to the Monterey mass killing that is the current alternative. He said that if you went to San Francisco in late '67 and saw the result on the street of turn on, tune in, drop out,
yeah,
you had to say that either Timothy Leary is being taken well out of his own context, or he's very naive.
That was all my dad's opinion of him, and basically my dad blames Timothy Leary for killing all of his friends or turning to hard drugs. Yeah, so there's a case to be made there. Yeah, the article that he later published was a cover story, and the headline was just Timothy Leary with many E's across the front of the front of the newspaper. Rose Kelly.
Well, I think he's like so many of those sorts of figures, is don't take them too seriously.
Yeah.
I think that the trouble is that when a thought form becomes fashionable, to me it ceases to be interesting.
Okay.
And the trouble with the hippie thing was, if you read, for example, Derek Taylor's book 50 Years Adrift, very rare to get a copy, which is about life with George Harrison and John Lennon in the mid 60s. If you saw what they were going through, they had a very refined and beautiful experience of psychedelia and idealism. When that trickles down to the physical conditions in which most people live, and you try to live that, you simply hit up against reality. Yep. And the result is mental breakdown.
This is still a problem today. I mean, because psychedelics have again become so fashionable and promoted by rich celebrities in Los Angeles and thereabouts, and people forget that the world does not live like rich celebrities in Los Angeles.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. And yes, I mean, drugs have always been the problem with Aleister Crowley, haven't they, with his reputation and his influence. But I remember, he wrote some very harsh things against them, as well as appearing to give license. One of the things that people don't realize is he wasn't a heavy drug taker. It sounds ridiculous, but even when he was at his most experimental, the measurements of hashish he would put into a thing were measured precisely, and he would only take a little until he got an effect. He didn't OD. He didn't have bad trips.
That's a good
Heroin
point.
was the problem
Yeah.
because it was the only cure for his asthma. He was recommended it by Dr. Harold Batty Shaw, the family doctor in Harley Street, one of the top doctors of London society. And he said, if you've got bronchial asthma as badly as you've got, the only thing that I can tell you that we seem to have success with is heroin, which he got from the chemist, not from a backstreet dealer.
Yeah, I think that's worth underlining again, because I think obviously people have such a view of Crowley as a drug addict, but that's a situation that people get into now today a lot, where they get prescribed opiate pills like OxyContin, and then they run out, and then they have to turn to street heroin, and they basically become addicts through the healthcare system, which
it's
seems
very easy to become addicted, isn't it?
Well, it's freaking heroin. It's like I think William Burroughs put it.
To anything though. It's easy to get addicted to anything which provides a bit of relief.
Opiates are the cure for pain, so you can see why people would. It's like the negative number that solves the equation. So you can see why people would become addicted to them. I think Burroughs pointed out at one point, people don't understand marijuana, psychedelics, things like that. These are means to an enhanced perception of life. Heroin is a way of life. Mm. And I think that seems to be true of Crowley, unfortunately.
A way of life for Crowley, heroin? I think it's very interesting. And there's a lot of this in the Paris book, because he wrote a series of notebooks. They only usually talk about one, but actually three, where he deliberately tries to kick the habit through some quite clever strategies, which never quite work, because the thing that's driving it keeps coming back, which is the asthma. Mm. If you've never had asthma,
I do have asthma.
I've had it, and and I had a friend who was chronic asthmatic. It's a nervous disease. It's set off by certain kinds of stress. That's why he called it Kangchenjunga phobia. Mm. Crowley did. Kangchenjunga phobia means that something happened on that mountain which upset his nervous system permanently.
Well, for me,
I'm surprised it wasn't K2 phobia, because Chogo Rife, because he had a far more physically demanding time, I think, on Chogo Rai than he did on Kangchenjunga. Huh. But of course, Kangchenjunga ends with the deaths of two of his fellow climbers, and I think one of the coolies, as they were called in those days.
Well, for me, it's always set off by cold rather than stress. So I wonder if there's something with that being on a freezing mountain.
Yeah. It's. But he did not recommend these things for other people. But the Book of the Law was telling him it's okay. But of course, look, the Book of the Law says, to worship me, take wine and strange drugs. Well, it doesn't tell you what these strange drugs are, does it?
Yeah, and one thing that's been pointed out to me is it says strange drugs, which means ones you're not familiar with, meaning ones you're not addicted to.
Yes.
New ones.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to finally chase this point of Rose Kelly, and then I want to ask you about John St. John afterwards, which I'm very interested in. So Rose Kelly, and I won't ask any preamble questions now. Rose Kelly, what role did she play in the actual transmission of the Book of the Law, and how significant was that?
I think this has all been written down before. She set out the whole scenario. She was the one who told him that he should go into the room, those 3 lunchtimes. She even came up with the original ritual for invoking Horus, which Crowley said was magical nonsense, made no sense at all. And she told him what it was. She told him that the being was called Aiwas. Hell, somebody should have interviewed her, really. That was another thing I didn't mention about this breakup of their marriage. The book reveals, I think for the first time in a book, that Crowley may have had a child with one of his girlfriends, and the mother came to Rose, to their flat in Warwick Road in Earl's Court. Do you know that story?
I don't.
Well, all the material is in the book on Crowley in Paris. And it does look like that might have been the final straw for her. But the final straw for him was that she refused he paid for her to go to a brand new thing as therapy for alcoholic women set up in Leicester. And I managed to trace exactly who was doing it. And it was a guy from his old college at Cambridge.
Huh.
And the building's still there in Leicester, funnily enough. And I think it's an old people's home now. But he paid for her to go there, which was an experimental thing on getting wealthy alcoholics off the juice. And she left without completing the course. So he was getting very fed up with it.
Yeah, I mean,
she also had, Kelly's view, because he said he was involved with the divorce proceedings. Gerald Kelly's view was that Crowley was entirely to blame, that he was constantly misbehaving, that he was adulterous, and was not a proper husband. My feeling about that was that they'd never had a proper marriage, but they loved each other, and I think I'm sure that I have a strong feeling that she was also involved with, had flings of her own. Now, Crowley's whole philosophy was, if thou lover wilt depart, so he would have allowed that, might have even been amused by it. There was a guy chasing her for years called Gormley, who was a doctor, a military doctor, who was an alcoholic. And he even invited Gormley up to spend the summer with Boleskine. Now, that should tell you something. I don't think he was interested in threesomes or something.
Do you think that was with Crowley?
He found it amusing. I think he found it amusing to watch this guy fawning after his wife.
And presumably carrying through with getting to know her better, shall we say?
We don't know. There's no evidence for that particularly. No. I think Crowley said whenever he talked about it, it was agonizingly long death to a relationship. The relationship had gone past its high point. I think the moment that Lilith died, I think that they were on a downhill from then. But they saw each other loads. Even when they were divorced, they were still living together. They did love each other. And, it just became impossible. In the end, she I don't know whether she knew he was having an affair with Victor Newberg, for example. She called him Newbugger. So she knew that Crowley was bisexual. So, how much she'd told her or how much she actually knew, I'm sure she knew quite a lot about it. She was very broad-minded and more sexually free. She wasn't a shrinking violet,
yeah.
Rose. She was. I'd love to have met her. She must have been quite a character.
Yeah, it's such a human and tragic and humanizing story. And thank you for talking about it.
She also was a clairvoyant,
Okay.
I don't know. That's come out. She used to do clairvoyant readings for when he was got involved with the Earl of Tankerville. She did clairvoyant readings for him and his wife. So he trained her a bit, or she just had a natural ability. But he regarded her as a clairvoyant, and that's why he was prepared in the end to listen to her in Cairo, if the story he tells is true. The notes that exist of the period suggest, unfortunately, a lot of the pages have been ripped out. So there's nothing in there about receiving the Book of the Law at all. There are no notes on that.
Do you have any sense of why?
Why what?
There are pages ripped out?
No idea. Absolutely none. It doesn't sound like Crowley to rip pages out.
Maybe Rose.
Might have been Rose, yeah.
Maybe things about her infidelities.
Yeah, it's that's very interesting. It could well have been. She did. Some of the letters that he wrote to Kelly, her handwriting's on them. Elizabeth Taylor used to do this with Richard Burton's diaries. She used to read them and make comments in the diaries. Yeah,
interesting.
I think the relationship between Rose and Crowley was actually much richer than people had imagined. I think it was a multifaceted relationship. I think it was it was like a modern
sounds
marriage.
Like it. Yeah, it sounds like it. It sounds like very, very much like a lot of people that I know. And I think that I really wish this period was more documented, because it seems to have been such a profoundly creative relationship in terms of whatever that dynamic, whatever that dynamic was producing the Book of the Law, as well as, such a fruitful period for Crowley. I wish it had been more documented. But you mentioned one thing I don't want to get away also is I hadn't heard this before. You mentioned
Can I just say something about that?
Yes,
very quickly,
yeah,
because I think it's an important point.
Mm-hmm.
The Book of the Law is Crowley's subconscious answer to Buddhism. It's the rebellion of Crowley's subconscious to Buddhism. That's what the Book of the Law is. If you actually look at what it's saying, remember, Crowley really was about to become a Buddhist missionary. He was fascinated by Alan Bennett. He was going to see Bennett for the second time, going all the way into the heart of Burma to find him at his monastery. Now, as you know, Alan Bennett led the first Buddhist Sangha to the West.
Yes.
And in 1913, he comes to London and founds the Buddhist Society in London. And there's a Buddhist bookshop then in Bloomsbury, which Crowley visits. Doesn't like the guys much who are running it. I'm not surprised. But that's what the Book of the Law target is Buddhism. It's the spirit of resignation that he also saw in Christianity. In the end, his view of the weaknesses of evangelical Christianity as he saw it, as he'd experienced it through his mother and uncle, not through his father, that's something else, has colored his view that, and of course, Alan Bennett's view of Buddhism was very mixed in with Western mysticism as well, and even imported some magical ideas into it. So for him, Buddhism, it's this whole spirit of resignation, and his inner being just revolts against this.
I think that's a very healthy. That's a healthy revolt. Is this just your personal feeling, or do you base this on anything?
Well, there's plenty of Crowley's writings when he takes on Buddha. There's whole passages of his diaries when he was at Cefalù where he's having arguments with Buddha. I mean, they're having it out, slanging it out, and Crowley, in the argument, is that Crowley sort of gets the better of him, and he calls him in the end that old hypochondriac. Everything is sorrow. Isn't that bad? It's like somebody who's always perennially ill. That's
interesting you point this out. I mean, like the Book of the Law still, for me, packs that profound punch. And I've read it at times where I realize that it's a profoundly liberatory text, and it is also profoundly liberatory if you read it in the sense, not that it is liberating from like Edwardian Christianity, but like common New Age Buddhist faux Christian miasma that we all swim in to one degree or another, that is just like popular occultism that's just around. It's profoundly liberating from that. And I think that my experience, I've been interviewing people for 7-8 years plus on this podcast, and I've been involved in occult matters for over 25 years. I mean, most people seem to default at some point to a kind of vague Buddhist, well, it's just nice to be nice. A Sunday school. I love how you put that. I think that's so on point. And it's just like, well, what does that mean? What is that? Okay. Like, and Thelema is so radically, punctures through that, which I think is very healthy, even from a Reichian perspective.
Yes. And, I don't know. You asked earlier, did Crowley send people mad in this period and things like that? And he might have sent the odd person sane, I don't know.
Sure.
But he reckoned that Jesus, or the figure on which the Jesus myth, as he would put it, was based on, if there was a figure, he'd say that the world wasn't ready for the kind of spiritual liberty that Jesus was actually getting towards. was what one thing he made the point of. I'm not sure the world's ready for Crowley either.
I don't think so. But what a gift his work is to those who are interested in it. It's a profound gift. I think that his comment at some point that he's building an ark to save civilization in is correct.
Yes, absolutely right.
Yeah. So, and also, I didn't suggest that Crowley sent people mad. I suggested that people accuse him of this.
Yes,
but
that's right. I knew you meant that.
Yeah. But I do want to, because I have not heard that Crowley was in a nursing home after the end of the marriage. I believe Rose was.
That's where.
What's the story with that?
Well, he had terrible problems with his throat. He had growths in his throat, if I remember right. Possibly cancerous was feared. And I think he was just run down as well, and profoundly hit by the death of Lilith. He'd crossed America, he crossed the Atlantic. He comes back to, I think the ship docked at Liverpool, if I remember right. I'm not going to swear to that, but almost immediately getting off the ship, he's told the news. He's excited he's going to be reunited with his wife and daughter. And he's told, no, she died so many weeks back. And no one had told him. It was devastating. And he said he kept breaking down all the time. And yet he kept still doing his devotionals. Very interesting. Wow. But then he was very ill, and he was at the, unfortunately, it's been knocked down. It was the Colston Hotel in Surrey, if I remember right. And used to be there. It was knocked down, I think, in 1973. Now, if we were in India, that hotel, that nursing home, it became a hotel. Colston Park Hotel would be a holy site.
Yes,
That's where he contacted God.
Where people would come to say, "Please heal my tooth pain."
Yes,
and
yes, there'd be a shrine.
Yeah, yes,
there'd be a shrine to Guru Sat Guru Crowley. You see,
as he was, I think.
Yes. He was the guru, but and he wanted to do it with humor and without pretension.
And I think he was clear and honest, and his material is so phenomenally useful for those who are not caught up by the demon Crowley. He's just one of the best. He's probably the best writer on the subject ever, by a long shot. I would say by a long shot.
Partly because he's not writing on the subject when he's writing on it.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's really trying to get you to go further than the kind of conceptualizations that are familiar to magical and occult writing.
Do you think that's one of the things that threatened the theosophical side of things?
Very much so, yes. Yes, I think they saw very clearly that they're cozy. We're just looking for truth. Truth. That's all we're looking for. Truth. He saw that in the end that they were just building themselves a house in their own image.
Yeah, I mean, you may have had this experience as well, but just interacting with theosophists is some of the most humorless people I've ever met, and repressed and profoundly miserable in some cases. It's just not a good time. And
no, I mean, he recognized
it's just gibberish. Also, it's just like you read this stuff, and it's like it's fun to read. It's like reading Kenneth Grant. It's fun to read, but it's like what? Okay, like what? Where are we going here?
Yeah, it's very difficult to call it anything. Crowley called it toshosophy.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think when the things that people have accused Crowley of and still do in the press, they should be describing theosophy. That's you want the crazy stuff. That's what it is. All religions are one, so we don't even have to. I mean, if all religions are one, well, why don't we have one religion?
Well, I think they certainly wanted one religion and them to be it.
Yes, but of course they then start arguing amongst themselves about who's going to run it, and which you then got the Western theosophists, and then you've got the what happened.
Yeah,
because Blavatsky I think, was trying to plot the destruction of the British Empire through Hinduism.
Why? That's an interesting take on it. Why?
Well, she was a relative of Count Witte, who was a leading Russian diplomat. He was their foreign minister.
Yet another Russian hacker.
Well, what she was doing was of interest to the British Secret Service because they had no reason to trust her at all. In fact, the Theosophical movement probably played a bigger part in Indian independence than any other movement from Europe. Certainly more than communism, and even fascism, which also had popularity in India, as you know.
Does,
yeah. So no, I mean, Theosophy in the end destroyed the confidence that educated Indians had in what the English had been trying to say, that there was, a better civilization. we have something to contribute to your civilization. And Blavatsky said, no, it's all the other way around. It's the West must learn from India.
And that's very much still an idea that's prevalent.
Yeah. Did you ever read that book, Karma Cola?
Yes, I love that book. I read that in India, actually.
Right.
Book.
A good place to read it. Yeah. I think that's, and I wonder what George Harrison thought of that.
Yeah. Great book. I want to ask you about John St. John, because this is one of the most fascinating. I mean, your account of it is great, and this is such a fascinating and useful document because he's directly describing what a magical retirement and magical regimen is like, and it's one of the places in his writing where it kind of all comes together, and you can say, okay, well, here's like a kind of recipe for how you might put this stuff together. So I'm curious your thoughts about what he was up to there, and just your thoughts about that retirement in general.
Well, Crowley had this idea that, now I've discovered how you can have knowledge and conversation with your holy guardian angel. How can I get this over to people so that they can actually do it in their own time in a modern setting, and while engaged with an ordinary, what was then in 1908 a modern, I suppose, upper class man's life. So he goes to Paris and decides that, well, it ought to be possible to have the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel at will. One should be able to simply be able to do it. This would prove what he got on the masthead of the Equinox magazine he produced, the aim of religion, the method of science. If you could get the aim of religion, which is union with God, to use that word, or the absolute.
Was that a Texas accent?
Yeah, I know. If you could do it at will, then you've proved that the essence of religion is a feature of scientific experience. In other words, knowledge. It's something you can know how to do, and that would prove his whole point, which is do what thou wilt. You find the true will of a person is to reach their highest potential consciousness. And the highest potential consciousness is symbolized by the idea of the relationship with a holy guardian angel. I believe the first reference, by the way, to a guardian angel is in the book of actually, I think there's a toss-up between the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch. I was only writing this. I'm writing about the Book of Enoch at the moment.
Oh, excellent.
And I want to get to the bottom of that. Anyway, it goes back to this idea that a person there is a being in a higher dimension that has your interests as part of that being's activity. Crowley would also say yes, and it equates with the idea of the unconscious, as Jung expresses it in the Psychology of the Unconscious, which came out in 1915, which he read immediately. People talk about Jung today as if they've just discovered him. It's all been seen before.
I have yet to discover Jung. I've never actually read any of his books. It's kind of like one of these things I purposefully avoid.
You may be right. I made the mistake when I was interested in alchemy of reading his Psychology and Alchemy, 1943. And I wish I hadn't, because I think it gave me a completely wrong notion of what alchemy was about. Anyway, my book on alchemy comes out in September. Just hot on the heels of Crowley in Paris. We have yet more infernal goings on from the Churton stable. So yes, what I'm trying to get to is, what is he trying to achieve in Paris in 1908 in these 13 or so days, where he deliberately sets out to experience what he calls Adonai, which means the Lord. And while eating at fine restaurants, although he put himself on a fairly rigid diet and drinking fruit juice and not too much alcohol, and doing various yogic postures and concentrating, he'd learnt, I think there's a lot of this in the Crowley in India book about what techniques he was using of going through his body, through the chakras. And which means wheels, for those who don't know, wheels, which is also the word, I believe, associated with the cherubim. What's the word? Hebrew word, also means wheel. Anyway, a wheel is really a kind of divine presence. And you have the wheels in Ezekiel in the Bible. Ezekiel sees the wheels, and after seeing the wheels, he sees the form of a man on the divine throne.
Oh, is this the angelic rank? Is it Ophanim or something like that?
No, it's the origin of all Hebrew mysticism. It's the vision of the wheels in the beginning of Ezekiel. Nobody should even think of studying Crowley without having traversed at least the first 5 chapters of Ezekiel, because if that's not sort of registered, a lot of it won't make any sense.
What do you mean by that specifically? I say more about that.
Because the great characters and the Ezekiel he's by the rivers of Babylon. He's out there under the pressure of the Assyro-Babylonian Empire, who've exported all the aristocrats from Judah to Babylon. And they're pretty unhappy about it because their temple's been destroyed. And Ezekiel is one of those responding to these, being Jewish in Babylon and having lost your entire, what you thought was your reason to be, to serve God in the temple and so forth. And he has this vision when he sees a human figure at the heart of God. And Gillis Quispel, the Gnostic scholar, wrote about it. He said, this is the Son of Man is a person who's had this vision of some human form divine, as William Blake put it. Crowley had it in his Diana experience in August 1901. And he actually writes about the human figure in his what's called the Writings of Truth, which is his notebook diary of those experiences with Alan Bennett studying Raj Yoga. Anyway, so he's learned all this stuff about yoga, and he's using yogic techniques. I can't remember. You'd have to remind me. I mean, I'm 2 books ahead of what we're talking about yes. At the moment. But did he ever? I don't think drugs are involved in
I don't think so. No, he records having a drink or 2 at dinner, but I think that's about it.
Because that's the point. He wants to make sure that there isn't any contradiction. No one could say, well, of course, if you were high.
Yeah.
And he's also meeting sculptors and artists and lovely, wonderful ladies in the best cafes in Montparnasse, many of whom became very famous later on, like Nina Olivier, the model who became the wife of Leo Stein, Gertrude Stein's brother. And it was Leo Stein who revolutionized the collection of modern art. And he fell in love with the girl that Crowley had been a lover of for quite a few years. And they married, Leo Stein and her. And that's never been written about, that in fact he got one of Crowley's best girls. Crowley always thought that when she married, he lost her. He always felt that about girls who, when they got married, that somehow he'd lost them.
Understandable.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. The sort of domestication comes in, doesn't it? And the other loyalties.
Yes.
And anyhow, so yeah, well, that's what Johnson John. Why does he call it Johnson John? I think it's a sort of joke on John of Patmos, who's receiving the revelation. And St. John is an English surname. So
It also sounds like a drag name. I think it would be a very good one.
It does a bit, yeah. I think Johnson John is his idea of the person who's going through this. So we could all be John St. John.
It's a great name. Yeah, there's a famous drag personality in the U.S. named James St. James.
Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
TV
Nothing
personality.
new under the sun.
Yeah.
He probably got. Yeah, I wonder if he got it from. Anyway,
very possible. Very possible. Yeah.
I love that part of the book because I wanted to give the reader the feeling that they were going through every day on the streets of Paris in 1908. Very interesting year, lots of exciting things happening. And you feel you walk the streets with him, you've sat in the restaurant, you've gone back to his little hotel room where he's doing magical rituals as well. He's invoking gods, Hermes in particular, which you would expect because he wants a communication from the divine. And he's doing his postures and the hanged man posture. He liked to do a lot of his meditation in, which is lying on your back with your legs like in the hanged man posture in the tarot card trump. And Bob's your uncle just when he thinks nothing's bloody happening. And it's hard work. You can know psychologically he's going through quite a lot of hell in this week. And then the breakthrough happens. And then he writes it all up and he sends it off to his friend General. He wasn't General then. He was Captain Fuller. And he says, well, can you write that up for, put it in the Equinox? And then he basically forgets it, really.
Mm. It's a profoundly useful document.
I know, but this is Crowley all over. He wrote so many interesting things, and he'd done nearly all of it before he was infamous. I will say infamous rather than famous. He never really was famous. He was infamous. And sort of stuck today, hasn't it? The infamy. But he wrote these things. A huge number of his achievements are in manuscript, some of them not properly published yet or published in pirate copies. My God, he did the work.
Yeah.
He did the work.
Absolutely. What a privilege also to go back to that time. I know that
yes.
Proust I think in his last book of his Remembrance of Things Past has this epic, beautiful, moving passage where he talks about life in Europe and specifically in France before the war, and the life of the middle class and upper middle class society before the war, and how that will never return, and it's just lost. And I'm wondering if you had that sense of Paris, and also maybe Berlin in writing about
Berlin was the same. Berlin was the same, a lost world with lost characters, lost personalities, and all destroyed by war. War just destroys, and that's what it does. It stops whole movements. The tragedy, really. You really do feel at times with Crowley's career coming up to 1914 that it's really going to go somewhere, and that he would have had. I think the liftoff would have taken place at some point, but. Those wicked angels again, isn't it? I mean, it's what he called the Black Brothers, the ones who want to repress. If you look at the psychology of all the warmongers, it's all the mentality is always the same. They want to repress and control people.
You're thinking of Putin, I imagine.
Putin, in a long line.
Yeah.
Of mobsters, gangsters. People haters, duplicitous, liars.
We very much seem to be going through a depressingly regressive period, and I think that is for underlines how important what Crowley did was, and that
and why
ongoing effort.
We really need him now, and I think they need him in the East badly.
Yeah, I agree with you.
They need him in Russia, and I think we need him. I think the whole world needs the knowledge of Aleister Crowley. I don't know whether my books will help. Maybe they're not accessible to some people. I don't know. I just wanted to tell it how it was, as best I could, and in the hope that what I call the intelligent layman, people are not necessarily committed to something, but they have an inquiring mind with a spiritual aspiration that may be undefined or unformed, and certainly uncommitted, that they will see in Crowley's life, in its honesty, his warts and all. This wasn't a saint in the sentimental or Catholic sense. He never did wrong. He did lots of things wrong, and he did a lot of things right as well. And he wouldn't have done things right if he hadn't got it wrong the first time.
I think that makes him so much more valuable than a saint, if I can be sacrilegious. I mean, it's much better to have a person who shows you how to do it yourself than somebody to pray to heal your cut finger or something like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, this is it. This thing about doing it yourself. Well, how can you do it yourself unless you've got a system? And Crowley is all about what he wants to tell people is you've got a system, you just don't know it and you don't work on it.
Yeah.
You want somebody else to do it. It ain't going to happen. If you want God to help you, you've got to be part of that. That's that. It's no good saying, I'll sit back and watch while the angels do their work.
I couldn't agree more. Well, we're unfortunately coming to the end of our 2 hours. I would love to keep going, but that's perhaps a good note to wrap up on. I would.
Yes, I don't. Yeah, right. I'd rather on the positive than the news.
Yes,
the journalistic media.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of good news these days. But
there never was much, as I remember. But the thing is, we had far less of it. I might watch, one bulletin a day. Now it's 24-hour journalism. I think the journalism has become. Crowley wrote that wonderful letter in Magic Without Tears about noise, and he was talking about the BBC during the war, and he recognized it was all propaganda. Or most of it was, and he said in the future, he said people when they work they will be listening to this stuff all day long, brainwashing them, brainwashing.
Well,
and that's where we are. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to get kicked out of the Zoom room, unfortunately. I would love to have you back on when your alchemy book comes out, for sure. And in the meantime, where can people find? Aleister Crowley in Paris is the book. It is, I'm sure, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, IndieBound, everywhere, or from Inner Traditions. And where can people find out more about you and your work and upcoming books and previous books?
I have a modest website called tobiaschurton.com, and there all my current projects are there, and also information about past works. And there's music on it as well. I think I put three of my albums on. So there's lots to listen to.
Wonderful.
So, yes, that's all. Yeah. It's not the complete guide, but it is to the books. I think you've got a good insight there. And they all link up with Barnes & Noble and Amazon and all the rest of it.
And of course, now that the Crowley series is complete, people can read it all at once. They can dive in and do all 6.
Aren't they lucky?
Indeed.
I wish I had that experience.
I agree.
I heard once.
I wish I had that experience when I first got into Crowley, that I had this view of him rather than Simmons or somebody like that.
Yeah, well, we all had to go through that, didn't we? Mm-hmm. John Simon's thing. I know, but it was a very readable book, John Simon's, but it created the Demon Crowley again, didn't it? Yeah. But I think I'd say that I wanted to do a clean look at Crowley, just wipe away all the barnacles and all the accretions, get all this rubbish out, and just show it as best I can as it was, given the limitation. Well, I think books are fantastic. Real books are fantastic. But you've always got a limit of words. You nowadays with publishing, they don't like books to be too thick.
Yes.
Because of costs. And well, it's fair enough. It's a discipline. In the same way that the old albums were great, vinyl, you had 40 minutes to make your statement. If you can't do it in 40 minutes, pray for a double album.
Right. Well, some of those double albums were phenomenal. So,
Yes. But they wouldn't be now so much, I think. Although I've just had a double album, Frank Zappa for Christmas.
Oh, which one?
Which I'm looking forward. It's the soundtrack of the movie that was done last year.
200 Motels or
no, about him. It's a documentary about him.
Okay.
It's over 2 hours long, and it was really wonderful. You didn't have to like even Zappa's music, although there's so many different styles. Everyone should love something of Zappa. But what is great is his philosophy of making music and being courageous, honest, and just bloody marvelous. I loved his attitude.
Yeah, Zappa is phenomenal. It's interesting how he also has become a bit of a forgotten genius. Although I think Frank Zappa of all the musicians of the 60s and 70s is probably like the least acceptable to younger people. Perhaps I can just imagine their brains exploding listening to some of Zappa's stuff.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, he could have written pop songs. He certainly had the ability, but there was no way he was going to, as he would put it, sink to that level. He wanted to constantly challenge people, and I think it's so admirable that there was somebody doing that, and also somebody who had the guts in 1967 to take the piss out of Sgt. Pepper.
That was great. I think he became a Republican in the 80s, didn't he? I think, which really alienated the majority.
I think
he did. Yeah, I think he did. It alienated quite a lot of people, but it was Zappa being contrary as usual.
It must have been very brief, because do you remember when the Soviet Union fell apart?
Of course.
He was asked by Václav Havel, the Prime Minister of Czechoslovakia, to be their representative for trade in America, and the CIA got onto the Czech government and said, "You either deal with us or you deal with Zappa." So I don't think that would have endeared him to Republicans.
Well, I'm looking it up now. He described himself as a American conservative in line with libertarianism, but not a Republican.
Yes.
So I got that wrong.
That's very Crowley, isn't it?
Very much so.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I see
conservative libertarian. Yeah.
It's an underrated position, and very underrated these days. Well, I see it's gotten dark there, so I really appreciate this conversation. It was great. I always enjoy having you on, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
Splendid, Jason. Many thanks indeed.
Thank you. Talk to you later.
I've enjoyed it. Okay. I've enjoyed it.
All right. Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
All right. Hope you really, really enjoyed that. I definitely had a lot of fun in that conversation. Meet us at magick.me, magick.me, my school for magic, meditation, and mysticism, where you can learn all the skills you need to unleash your true self. I will see you in class, and until next time, hang in there.